Okay, so Joy, I think we can get started. I don't have anyone else waiting to come in.
Okay, well, I'll just pray. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for the opportunity to meet like this and to hear from Sondra and all about the beautiful and courageous residents that live in Judea, Samaria, Lord. Oh, Father, our heart goes out to them. Thank you for that new movie that David Friedman and Mike Pompeo are bringing out on Route 60. And Lord, I pray that it will prompt more people to pray for the residents of Judea, Samaria, and particularly, Lord, to keep them safe on that road that's seen so many incidents of terrorism recently. Lord, thank you for them and what they're doing. We know without them being there would be no Israel, really. So, Lord, we just thank you again to hear more about what's happening in Israel, the good and the bad. And, Lord, thank you that you're over it all. We pray this in your name. Thank you, Father. Amen.
Amen is
I'll
right.
mute myself, and if everybody else can mute themselves. Barry's iPhone is not muted.
Oh, there's more people waiting to come in.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we will get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's great to be back. It's great to be back here. And we have a lot to talk about today, and I want to really make sure to leave time for Q&A, because I know those of you, and I'm sure most of you, are following the news from Israel. It is quite distressing. Yesterday, Joy and I had a conversation, just kind of what's going on, and she said to me, "So tell me, Sondra, is it really that bad?" And I said, yes, it is really that bad. But, you know, of course, everybody you talk to is going to give you a different perspective on what's really going on. So now you get to hear my perspective. And of course, I would love to have time afterwards, as I said, for questions and answers. It is complicated. I'm not going to go into all the nitty gritty of the judicial reform. We've discussed this a bit in the past. I've also written about it. But I don't think the nitty gritty is the issue right now. And so what I want to discuss is how people are feeling. Very often, the way people are feeling is the essence, okay? And so that's what we really need to be paying attention to. So just to summarize, okay, the government we have now is a right-wing government, which gave us a great deal of joy. You know, we have, and I have not had my sense of this over the past couple of years. We've all had our share of disappointment from our political leaders. And I think all of you, from wherever country you're from, probably share that sentiment. At the end of the day, political leaders are not what they used to be. I don't know if they were ever good. Maybe it's just that our media and social media and all that is enabling us to see sides of our political leaders that we may not have seen before. But as you can well imagine, there are problems. There's problems with the politicians. On the other hand, when you have a government that comes in that is, you know, ideologically speaking, aligned with most of your values and is, declares that it's going to put forward policies that you agree with, of course, it's wonderful. Now, the judicial reform issue has become an issue for the right in recent years. And the reason is because we have a situation. First of all, one of the problems in Israel is that we do not have a constitution. So a lot of the issues having to do with the role of the Knesset, the parliament, in passing legislation, and the role of the courts to review legislation. And this is, of course, very important, that there is this checks and balances, that there is an independent judiciary on the one hand, and there is an independent legislature on the other hand. But exactly what the relationship is between those two bodies was never set in a constitution, because we don't have a constitution. And in fact, the actual role of each one of those bodies, you know, how do you elect people to the Knesset, how many people are in the Knesset, these issues were taken care of in Israel of starting at the beginning of the state in a series of what is called basic laws. And the reason they're called basic laws is because they are quasi-constitutional laws. In other words, they are the types of laws that you would find in a constitution. For example, what is the Knesset? What is the Supreme Court? What is the army? Who is responsible for this, that, and the other? So there are laws about this. Some of them were passed at the very beginning of the state. Others were passed along the years. Now, when you have a constitution, usually you have a part of the idea of a constitution is that the laws that make up the constitution are passed in a different way than an ordinary law. That I know in the United States, for example, the Constitution has to be, or any amendment, I mean, the original Constitution was passed, in 1789 or something. But the amendments to the Constitution have to be passed by a supermajority of the legislature, but it also has to be ratified by a supermajority of the actual states, because the United States is a federal government. But every country has its rules for what makes up a constitution. And I think it's consensus, really, across countries and the way people see, that if you're going to be able to knock down a law passed by the Knesset, if a court is going to be able to knock down a law passed by the Knesset, it needs to be on the basis of some other law. If that some other law can just as easily be passed or canceled the same way that the law you're referring to, then you can argue, well, what gives this law priority over that law? And of course, this is a question that came before the Supreme Court many, many years ago. And over the years, for example, there was a consensus that the basic laws should be treated as a quasi-constitutional laws, which makes sense in terms of the nature of those laws, but it doesn't necessarily make sense when you think of the fact that basic laws can be passed by a simple majority, okay? All this kind of went fine for a while, but then a number of years ago, there was a Supreme Court justice named Aaron Barak, and he actually put forward what today people refer to as the first judicial reform, but it was done in a very quiet way, decision after decision, and never came to a vote. It was based on Supreme Court decisions. And the main thing that happened was there was a law that was passed as a basic law a number of years ago that talked about civil rights. Okay, it was actually called the Human Dignity and Liberty Law, or something like that. Okay, I'm roughly translating from the Hebrew. And basically, it's the kind of law that you would want to have in any Bill of Rights, so to speak. The people have the right. And there was another one that talked about the freedom to engage in business or whatever. So basically giving people freedoms. They have the freedom to make their own decisions. They have the freedom to be treated honorably and with respect. And they have freedom in general, okay? No one can force them to do things, etc. What happened then is over the years, there were a number of laws that were knocked down because they were seen to come against that law. Now, let me give you an example, okay? A number of years ago, there was a huge problem in Israel with illegal immigrants. People were literally walking to Israel from Africa. So we had people, I'm not talking about refugees here who are refugees from war, and those come into a different status. We have people from Africa who were living in difficult conditions, and they are looking for opportunities. And Israel, as Netanyahu once said, was the only country that was literally walking distance from Africa. Today, you see people coming on leaky boats and trying to get into Europe and all kinds of stuff, but it's a lot easier to come to Israel than to get on a leaky boat and try to get to Italy. So we had this huge problem. So when you have a certain number of people coming in and you help them out and they can have a job and whatever, but it became a flood, and this flood became a real problem because nobody was really figuring out who these people were. Some of them were settling in particularly poor areas of the country, in Tel Aviv, for example, and some of these people were not very nice people. We had a sudden increase in crime, and it was just a very, very bad situation. So we had both a situation having to do with crime. We also had a situation having to do with demography. Okay, Israel, like any other country, has immigration laws. And in Israel, it's very, very important that we're controlling our immigration because we want to make sure we're a Jewish country. Okay, so you have, in this sense, then, two competing values. What do you do with these people? You want to throw them out? Well, everybody would agree you can't just dump them in the sea. You want to send them to somewhere where they can go, okay, where they can live and whatever. The question is, can you force them out of the country? So the Knesset passed a law that based on certain criteria, you can remove these people from the country because they came in illegally. They don't belong here. And there is this value called Israel as a Jewish state. And that's important. The Supreme Court at that point decided, no, that's not an important enough value. More important is the individual civil rights of these non-citizen illegal immigrants. Now, this is a very important value-based debate. And there are people on both sides of the equation. What is more important, the individual civil rights of an illegal immigrant or keeping Israel a Jewish state? And this is just one example to show where over the years, it became clear that the judges who make up the Supreme Court were overwhelmingly left-wing, liberal, secular, okay? And so we felt on the right that they didn't value enough the values that we hold dear, like Israel as a Jewish state, like religious values, the importance of the Bible, all kinds of issues like this. And this became an issue, which is why people on the right have been already trying for a long time to change the makeup of the Supreme Court. Now, what did happen is in the last few years, Ayelet Shaked was the Minister of Justice. She really accomplished quite a bit because there were a number of judges that came up for appointment. You know, judges have to retire at 70. When they retire, so they have to choose judges to replace them. And so there was, she did have the opportunity through dialogue, through compromise, to get a number of conservative judges elected to the court. So today we have more conservative judges than we did 10 or 20 years ago, but there's still a majority of liberal. So how do we change the makeup of the court, and how do we get the court to be more balanced, to more accurately reflect who the people of Israel are today? Israel today as a country is quite a spread of liberal and conservative, when actually conservative is definitely the majority. Okay, and so the Knesset will more accurately reflect the values of the public because they are elected. The courts, the judges who are appointed, won't necessarily reflect that. Okay, so this is the main issue that is the basis of the need for reform. When this government came in, now there were different proposals for reform, including a number of proposals that were put forward by people who are today in the opposition. There's a consensus across Israel that there's a lot wrong with the judicial system that needs to be fixed. There are some people like Gideon Sa'ar, for example, who was a major figure in the Likud, and until recently was considered definitely right-wing. He's still right-wing, no question he's right-wing. He's today in the opposition for a number of reasons, but he's definitely right-wing. And he has his own proposal for reform. And in fact, there are many, and he's today one of the biggest opponents to the reform that is being put forward by this government. Well, many people say, well, what's the difference between the two? So he will say, oh, there's a major difference. Others will say, no, it's not such a major difference. You know, and there are plenty of people who say, well, why don't we just put forward Gideon Sa'ar's plan? It was perfectly fine. You know, I don't have an answer to these questions because when you look at the issues that are separating some of these proposals, and I'm not talking about the left wing, that's a whole different ballgame, but some of these people who are really part of the right, when you look at the difference in their proposals, very often the differences are more political than they are ideological, or they're more strategic rather than, you know, actual changes in the ideology behind it. Okay, so that brings us to where we are now. In January, the government takes a position, and one of the first things that they do, the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, puts forward a whole big plan of judicial reform. So one of the mistakes he made was that he comes out with this major announcement, I'm changing everything. Okay, well, that's a very threatening thing. You come up and you say, we're going to change everything from A to Z, everything having to do with the justice. And he puts forward proposals that include some very extreme kinds of things. Some of them are very reasonable. But what happens is it gets a lot of people very, very nervous. Now, some of the people who are most nervous are the people who know that they are going to be losing power. Okay? For years now, the left understands that they will never lead the government of Israel because there isn't a majority of the left. There is a nice group of people in the center. The center can connect to the left. They can connect to the right, depending on what the issues are. So The left, though, the real left, is never going to run the country, or at least not for quite some time. So you have people on the left that are very frustrated by that. And the only way they were able to have any influence over policy in Israel was through the courts, because the Supreme Court in particular reflected left-wing points of view much more than the Knesset or the government. And so they, rightfully so, were feeling very threatened by this judicial reform. If it were only the left that felt threatened by this reform, nothing would have happened. You'd have had some protests. You would have had some, yelling and screaming in the Knesset, which is not new. Maybe you would have had a little bit of changes here and there, and that would have been it. All the laws would have passed. The problem was that the left succeeded in convincing huge numbers of people, both in the center and even on the right, that this legislation was too extreme. Now, first of all, they were very clever. They used the idea of democracy. And they said, this reform is a direct threat to the continued democracy of Israel. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree with me, nobody wants to live in a country that is not a democracy. And Israel has always been a very healthy democracy. We just, the amount of yelling and screaming that goes on in our Knesset and on our streets and demonstrations. You could say it's a little noisy, it's a lot not so pleasant to listen to, but there's no greater testament to the health of our democracy that everybody is perfectly free to express whatever opinion they want, and they know nothing is going to happen to them. It doesn't matter if they're extreme right or extreme left or anything in between, they can express their opinions. Of course, they cannot be violent. That's a whole different ballgame, or incite to violence. But if they're just expressing their opinion and what they think needs to happen, not a problem. So we certainly have a healthy democracy, and it's something that Israel treasures very much. What the left succeeded in doing is not just showing or presenting this whole judicial reform as a threat to democracy, but they also played on some of the most deep-setting fears of not just the secular, but the center and also the right. And that is two things. Number one, what you could be describe as a hostile takeover of the country by the far right, ultra-Orthodox. And secondly, giving legitimacy or power to corrupt politicians. And it was these two issues that has propelled so many people in the country to join the protests against judicial reform. A lot of the people want judicial reform, but they don't want the possible consequences that could come from this particular piece of legislation. Now, while I believe that the two people who have been most aggressive in promoting this reform, Yariv Levin, who is the Minister of Justice, and Rotman, who is the head of the Judiciary Committee in the Knesset, these two people, I believe, are true ideologues, and they're really trying to change the situation to create a more balanced court. The problem is, number one, they're both, the two of them are similar personalities. They are very black and white, and they're not very good at dealing with people. They're not very good at creating coalitions and having conversations. They want to impose their views on anybody, so on everyone. And so the way they've handled it has been stupid, okay? That's the one thing. On the other thing, at the same time, we had a number of statements and activities by the government that people saw that this judicial reform would protect them. For example, when the government was first put up, Aryeh Deri was supposed to be a minister, he was supposed to be the Minister of Finance, okay? Now, Aryeh Deri, in a plea bargain just a couple years ago, admitted guilty to tax evasion. Rightfully so, most of the people in the country are saying, how can you have someone, even though he, the plea bargain, he didn't even have to do time, I think, or he had to retire from politics. It was a dispute of what he had to do. But you could say, okay, it's over. He was guilty. Does it make sense to have someone who's guilty of tax evasion only recently, okay, be in charge of the tax system be the Minister of Finance, which is the Ministry of the Treasury, which is the person who levies the taxes, who collects the taxes. This is corrupt. Okay. Another issue that came up was the fact that Netanyahu, who was on trial for a number of charges of corruption. Now, you could say he'll be guilty, he'll be innocent. I think it's pretty clear from all the evidence we've seen so far that whether or not what he did will amount to criminal charges, that's a big question, and it could very well be that he will end up they will end up being innocent of everything. But it's clear that a lot of what he did was not appealing, was very problematic. And in any case, what is clear is that at least half the country thinks he's guilty. Okay, so when you have a prime minister who it was ruled by the attorney general that the prime minister cannot be involved directly in legal reform because he has an innate conflict of interest. If he is in a position to appoint judges, if he is in a position to change the way judges are appointed, and other things like that, this could have a direct effect on his own case that's being brought by judges, before judges. And so initially he did not get involved, and then he did get involved. And frankly, there were people, even on the right and even on the left, who wanted him involved because the country was going crazy. And Netanyahu was usually the kind of person who can kind of negotiate, calm people down, bring people to consensus. Okay. So his involvement initially was seen by many as a positive thing, but unfortunately he didn't succeed. Okay.
Sondra,
Yes.
didn't the Attorney General though ban him from saying anything publicly?
No, she ruled, that's what I'm saying. She ruled that there was a conflict of interest and therefore he couldn't get involved in the judicial reform. Not that he couldn't get involved in anything else, just in the judicial reform because of his conflict of interest. And he abided by that for some time, and then he decided, no, I'm getting involved. Okay, so again, I'm not here to discuss whether I think Bibi is guilty or not guilty of corruption, but you need to understand how it is being viewed. When so many people in the country believe that he's guilty, let's say half, okay, all right, for argument's sake, half the country, even if almost a half, not quite a half, think he's guilty, and at the same time believe that a lot of this judicial reform is being put forward in order to save his skin and keep him in politics. When at the same time you see that he's using different laws, and these laws, some of these laws are now coming up for discussion before the court, using some and passing laws which really officially didn't have anything to do with the judicial reform, but they are being passed at the same time by the same government, laws to ensure that, for example, someone like Aryeh Deri. So let's go back to Aryeh Deri. So he is a convicted criminal on tax evasion. He's appointed to Minister of Finance, and people bring a lawsuit to petition the Supreme Court to cancel, to disqualify that appointment. And the Supreme Court rules Deri cannot be a Minister of Finance. It doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. Okay. Now, I have to tell you, me and most of the people I know on the right were thrilled that the Supreme Court ruled that way, because we don't think, whether we like Deri's politics or we like his ideology or not, we don't think that it is right and it's honorable for the head of the tax authority to be someone who's a tax evader. It makes no sense, okay? But meanwhile, the same government is now trying to pass a law to prevent judicial scrutiny, and that was part of the problem in the law that passed last week, okay? The law that passed last week was a law that said the Supreme Court can no longer use the what is called reasonableness, the reasonableness standard to cancel, to knock down legislation passed by the Knesset. Now, I personally think this law makes a lot of sense, okay? Because they're not saying the Supreme Court can't rule on the reasonableness of, rule on any laws. It's just saying the reasonable standard is too amorphous. There's no specific criteria if something is reasonable or not. And basically it comes down to a given judge will look at something and say, I don't think it's reasonable. You could say, yes, but the Knesset member looked at that same law and said, I think it's reasonable. Who's to decide which person's reasonable standard is more than the other? So on the one, and that's really what happened. But on the other hand, and there are other reasons that the Supreme Court can cancel an appointment. For example, it can cancel an appointment of a minister if they believe that the government used inappropriate criteria. For example, if the Prime Minister wanted to appoint Aryeh Deri as finance minister, and they could prove that the reason he wants to appoint him as a finance minister is so that he will give a tax exemption to Bibi's income. Okay, so you don't need unreasonable for that. You could say he's being appointed for the wrong reasons, and you don't even have corruption as a reason. It could just be, I want him to become a finance minister because he's my brother-in-law. Okay, that doesn't mean he's corrupt. It doesn't mean that he won't do a good job, but he's appointing him because he's his brother-in-law. That is considered an unacceptable criteria, and that can still happen. That no one has changed the ability of the Supreme Court to knock down an appointment for that reason. They're just taking care of the reasonableness. Okay. On the other hand, you could say this issue of reasonableness, sometimes you do want a reasonable standard. What does it come down to? Who do you trust more? Do you trust the government or the Knesset to be reasonable? Or do you trust the Supreme Court to be reasonable? And this is really one of the biggest issues right now, because the people who are protesting today, it's not just about whether you're left or right. That's part of it. And no question the people driving these protests, and there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the way these protests have been driven, and the money that's being poured in the ideology and the motivation of the people running the protests. Okay, I have a lot of problems with those people. I'm talking about the people who are just ordinary people, decide to go out of their house on a Saturday night, wave an Israeli flag, and stand and protest. Why are they driving the protest? Why are they joining them? They're not being paid, for sure. Okay. Why are they joining them? They're joining them because they look at the government and they say, Bibi's a crook, Deri's a crook, Ben Gvir is nuts, he's an extremist, et cetera, et cetera. They'll go down the list. And the ultra-Orthodox is another problem. All these ultra-Orthodox people are doing whatever they can to ensure that the ultra-Orthodox never have to serve in the army. And they're saying, excuse me, this isn't fair. And this issue is going to come before the Supreme Court. It has already come before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has ruled and said it's not fair. Well, I look at that Supreme Court decision and I say that is reasonable. Because my 4 sons all served in the army. Most of them, well, one just graduated from the reserves because he's already 40. But, they've also been in the reserves. They put themselves in danger. And these people, and my sons I have 2 sons who are rabbis. I have sons who are just as committed to studying the Bible as the ultra-Orthodox. We don't believe that excuses us from serving the army and protecting the country. Okay. And so people that are protesting are saying that all these ministers are going to use the judicial reform to propel their interests in a way that is not good for the country. I understand this. I really understand where they're coming from. And in many ways, they're right. I just think that the judicial reform as a whole is a good thing for the country. Okay. But the way it is being handled by the government, by Netanyahu, by various ministers, instead of coming to compromises, is terrible. On the other hand, I can say the same thing about the left. Some of the people on the left who are fueling these demonstrations and the statements they are made are terrible. When we have pilots who are announcing that they are not going to continue serving, they are not going to go for training, and Air Force pilots train, and we're not talking about Air Force pilots who are in the regular military and even career officers in the military. Okay, there's a whole group of pilots who are in the reserves. They did their career, they did their officers, and now they went off and they're doing other things in life. Okay, they may fly for El Al, or they may be in computers or whatever. There may be businessmen, they're doing whatever. Air Force pilots in reserves, once a week, in other words, they work 4 days a week. Once a week, they are training. And Israel's Air Force relies very, very heavily on these reserve pilots who don't have to do this, okay? But it's part of the deal, so to speak. They're in the reserves, they do this, okay? Now, now these people, some of them are saying, oh, if we're at war, we'll come, but we're not going to go do training. Every single Air Force commander, including the chief of staff of the Israeli army, has said, if these people are not training once a week, then when it comes to war, they will do a worse job. Air Force pilots have to train once a week. They just have to keep themselves as top-notch as the Israeli Air Force is. So when these people suddenly start saying we're not going for training, and we have other IDF officers that are saying we're not coming for training and we're retiring from the reserves and all this kind of stuff, this is extremely dangerous. It is a direct threat to the country. And this, in my opinion, is where they have crossed every red line. There is no excuse whatsoever. You don't like a particular policy of the government. This is not what you do. You yell, you scream. There's also the protesters who have gone in, not just standing in the squares and protesting. They're going into the highways. They're blocking the highways. They're blocking the airport. They're setting fires in the middle of the highways, okay? The police, unfortunately, until recently, were in my opinion, far too tolerant of these illegal activities of the protesters. You want to protest in the squares and the parks, you want to close off the entrance to the Knesset. That's where protests belong. They don't belong in the middle of the highways. You see people driving home, they're stuck for hours in their car. That's when they did announce. Very often they would announce in advance. People in droves would stay home from work that day, especially if they could work from home, because they knew it would be impossible for them to get to work because the protesters blocking all the major highways. So these are very, very problematic issues and places where the protesters have crossed every red line, and it's very, very disturbing. Now, I just want to go back to something where I started. How are people feeling? So I gave you quite a sense, I believe, of how the protesters on the left are feeling, okay? Now I want to tell you how we on the right are feeling, other than feeling, we're critical of the government that they're not handling this well, because we want the reform in one version or another to go through. And so we're frustrated that the government is doing such a bad job in selling it to the public, because we think it's very sellable, okay, if it were handled properly, okay? But there's another issue here, and this is a very, very critical issue. In 2005, 18 years ago, government of Israel forcibly removed close to 10,000 people from their homes in Gush Katif, in the Gaza Strip, and additional 4 communities in northern Samaria. It was a time of intense pain. I was very involved. Me, my kids, my husband, we were at every single demonstration. Every demonstration. Now, we were not involved in anything illegal. We didn't block highways, etc. There were a few demonstrations that did try to block highways. The police stopped them every time. The way we were treated at that time in the media, by the government, in the Knesset, and by the police was absolutely outrageous. There was legal demonstrations that were set up, and buses that were coming from all over the country. People paid to get on these buses to go to the demonstrations. The police came and took the keys to the bus away from the bus driver and refused to let the buses drive to a demonstration. Now, if something like that would happen today, for these people who are demonstrating, there would be an enormous outcry in the media. Then the media was silent. It was okay, because we, the settlers, so to speak, we're not worth anything anyway. Our claims are not legitimate, etc., etc. It was a terrible, terrible time. And there is a lot of, and that left a wound, a kind of wound that kind of festered at a low level since then. Now, what you did have at that time, there was talk about, should we refuse to serve? And particularly soldiers who were part of the people that actually forced the people out of their homes, should these soldiers refuse to carry out these orders? And there was a lot of discussion about that. And the leadership of the settlement movement across the board called against any kind of refusal to serve. Because at the end of the day, they said, even if you have to do something that you think is very, very wrong, if we employ that tool of refusing to serve, we will tear apart the country. And so we didn't do that. And today we have people on the right, including myself, and my family and everybody who are my friends who are looking at what's happening today and saying, this isn't fair. I just now gave you, and I'm not even talking about the police, because after it all, there were even some people on the right, after we were already thrown out of our homes and it didn't matter anymore, that were willing to admit, people on the left, I mean, who were willing to admit, you know what, this wasn't handled properly. And minors were arrested and that should have happened. I don't want the police to go back to what they were doing then, because the way they were behaving then was wrong, okay? What I do want is the same way that I just now gave you a full presentation, enabling you to understand the pain of the left and the fear of the left. I want the left to look at what happened to us 18 years ago and say, I understand their pain. I may not agree with it, but I really, really understand their pain. I identify with their pain and I understand where they're coming from. And some of that is happening now, okay? Not enough. But some of it is happening. So what's happening today is kind of bringing back to us what happened then. And I have to say, this is being discussed all the time in the media. It is not being buried. All of these issues that are being brought up by the right, how would we treat it with the disengagement? It is all being brought up today again. And that is a good thing. Bottom line, do I think judicial reform is a threat to democracy? Absolutely not. Everything we're seeing in Israel today is a testament to the fact that our democracy is alive and well. What is the problem? The problem is there becomes so much passion and hatred and violence, and the streets, what we're seeing in the streets is so bad, okay, that somebody has to come in there, both on the right and left, and calm things down. We need to go back to discussion. I am convinced that with reasonable discussion, if the politicians would put aside their egos, we would be able to come to a reasonable compromise on judicial reform. It should have been handled differently to begin with. I think a lot of it would have been passed if it was done quietly, one law at a time, every few months, not announced as a major plan. That was threatening. It was handled poorly, and we have to deal with the consequences because there's already great damage that has been done. But this is what we're hoping that you know, and I don't know, I put the blame both on the right and the left for not handling this correctly. We'll see what happens now, but it is quite a problem, and it's something we have to realize. There is too many people in the country who don't trust Netanyahu and this current government as far as they can spit, even though a lot of those people agree with the ideologies that they represent. So that is something that we need to kind of keep in mind. So that's on that, and I really talked about this longer than I anticipated. But I do, before I open for questions and answers, I just want to bring two things that are kind of the other side of this, something that is, I think is give a positive spin on this also. First of all, I want to bring you up to date on something that happened recently. You know that on Passover, I'm sure you all remember, there was that horrific terrorist attack against the D family. A mother and two daughters were murdered by terrorists, and it was painful. You all saw that, you all followed it, and actually we got a lot of notes from people all over the world expressing sympathy and what can they do, and just as you know, I'm receiving this, says, oh, what is there anything we can do? I get a call from the high school in Kiryat Arba. Now it turns out that Rina D, who was 16, she was a student at the high school in Kiryat Arba, and it seems that the kids there were absolutely a mess. To know that, especially the girls in her class, their friend, their classmate was murdered in such a sudden and terrible way, and it really, really had a very problem. And the kids were really having a hard time with it, and the school, of course, was coping in many ways. And they had psychologists and teachers and rabbis and people really, you know, working with the girls to try to help them. And one of the things they wanted to do is give these kids something to do that was positive. And they created a lot of different activities that the kids could get involved with as a way of like in memory of Rina, and doing good things. When you're full of bad, when there's so much bad around you, do good, bring light to the world. And they did these wonderful things. And we got a call then from the high school, and they said, you know what, they really think what these girls need is a day out to go and just have fun and to come together and express their love for one another and just celebrate life in a way, excuse me, but at the same time, remembering Rina, giving them an opportunity to express what's going on with them, on the one hand, but, having this day of activity and fun. And they asked us if we could help fund this, because this was something that, they didn't know where to fund it, and they wanted to be able to give it as a gift to the girls. So we put out a note, we put it on Facebook, we sent it out to a few people, and there was real great responsiveness. And we were able to present a wonderful, wonderful gift to the school and to enable this to happen. And we had these great pictures of the kids having a great time, which we also posted on Facebook. And, this is all going on at the same time as all these riots and all these demonstrations. But I think so much of this tells much more. That kind of story is much more reflective of what Israel is and what Israel still is than these demonstrations. Because despite the fact that, there's a lot of hot tempers going on, when it comes to people in need, children who need a hug or whatever, there's always going to be somebody out there who's figuring this out and giving these children what they need. And to me, what was special about this whole thing was that when people wrote to me, oh, we feel so terrible about it, what can we do? I was able to give you and people like you something to do. When you're around the world, you're not going to be able to come and give these girls a hug. And some people sent notes, and that's very nice. But being able to contribute to something like this, then in a very practical way, really help these girls, that was very special. So I just wanted to give you that feedback and let you know great things are still happening in Israel. And I just want to conclude with this word from the Bible. Last week, we marked the 9th of Av, the fast day that is the anniversary of the destruction of both the first and second temples. And it's a day that we read the book of Lamentations and we reflect on the consequences. Of course, the Bible tells us the consequences of the destruction of the first temple, but we also reflect on the historical record of what happened in the second temple. And it was, when you think about it, it's a very depressing time. And one of the questions that keeps coming up now that we live in the state of Israel, we don't have the temple, but on the other hand, we have our independence. We have a wonderful country. We have more freedom and more prosperity today in Israel than we did in any time in our history. And it's just amazing. Even from a spiritual point of view, there's more Bible being studied today in Israel than at any time in our history. Things are great. They're not perfect. No, we still have a lot of challenges. But the question keeps coming up. Should we still be fasting and mourning on the 9th of Av? Why, is this still relevant? And of course, it's the prophet Zechariah who first raises this question. Is a very real-time historical issue, because Zechariah is living at the beginning of the second temple period, and they have been fasting and praying on the 9th of Av for 70 years. And now all of a sudden, they're back in the land of Israel, and they have built the temple. Okay, and so a question is directed to him. Should we continue? It's in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 3. Should we continue weeping in the 5th month? 5th month is Av. This is the 9th of Av. Should we continue mourning during this period of time? And it's very interesting because the answer he's giving is not a very, he gets an answer. I mean, it's God who gives him the answer, and the answer doesn't really so much answer the question. He doesn't say yes or no. What does God say? He says, you're the ones who've been crying and fasting on this day, not me being God. I don't fast. You're the ones who fast. Okay? He says, if you drink, you drink. Or if you don't drink, you don't drink. What does that have to do with me? Okay? And then he goes on and he says as follows. He says, just remember, okay, justice and truth is the way you should judge. Kindness and mercy you should do one to another. Widow and orphan, the stranger and the poor should not be oppressed. And you should never think ill of your brother. Okay? And basically, on the one hand, we still don't really know if they continue to fast and pray during the 9th of Av, during the second temple, and there's discussion of that because we don't really have an answer here. But I think that basically what God is trying to tell us here is that we need to decide whether we're fasting and praying, but it's not the refraining from eating or not. That's the issue. The issue is, what are we doing the fast for? If we're doing the fast for as part of repentance, in order to change the way we are, in order to recognize, well, maybe we were not kind, maybe we were not involved in justice, maybe we didn't look out for the orphan and the widow. If we're doing it in order to improve our ways, which of course is part of the reason we had this punishment of the destruction to begin with, then great. Okay. If not, what does it matter if you eat or you don't eat? And I think that's something to keep in mind. And it's something that we learn a lot about from the prophets. It doesn't matter as much what you're really doing. It matters much what is in your heart. It's not the technical issues of what you're doing. It's what stands behind what it is you're doing. But then Zechariah goes on in chapter 8 to have this wonderful, wonderful view when he talks about something that will happen. Okay, he says, the elderly men and women will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each one leaning on his stick because of their advanced age. And the streets of the city will be filled with children, with boys and girls who are playing in its streets. And I think we have to remember, we are here. We are the generation that is witnessing this, and not only in Jerusalem. We are witnessing this all over Israel, in Judea, in Samaria, in the Galilee, in the Negev, in Tel Aviv, everywhere. And so when we look at what's happening in Israel today, we have to keep the perspective. We are here. Many children and elderly and everybody is in the streets together, laughing and smiling and looking after one another. And I think always keep that perspective, because as much as things can sometimes be difficult, whether it's from enemies from abroad or whether from dissension within, we all have to keep in mind the amazing miracle that we are actually living in. And that is the fulfillment of Zechariah 8, 4, and 5. Go back and read those verses. They are amazing. Anyway, as always, I talk too much, but I would love to hear from you.
And vineyards are being planted on the mountains of Israel, and foreigners are coming to harvest them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Can I, I've just got here, sorry, the buses, the traffic are crazy.
Oh, hi, Janine.
But can I say, no matter where I am in Jerusalem, the Jewish people are so helpful. They are amazing, despite all the upheaval. The street is crazy. It's Meshuggah up here. There's everything you can imagine on the corner, and they've got people directing it, but they help you. Everybody has, like the bus stop, the driver was amazing. So I just want to say the Jewish people are incredible with everything that's going on. They always have time to stop and help you.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Janine. That's an eyewitness.
Yeah. And look, I see Mark has his hand up, but Sondra, you had a good news story about this family that couldn't get to their Shabbat.
Yeah. So there was So there was a family who was last week who was trying to get to Jerusalem for Shabbat, and they're religious, so they don't drive on Shabbat. So they're driving and they get stuck in traffic because of one of these demonstrations on Friday afternoon. And it gets to a point it's late and they know they're just not going to make it. So they have, it's, I think, a couple, maybe a baby, and they figure they're going to have to leave the car and go walk somewhere. And it's quite a hike from the road up to any of the communities. It's up a hill. And so the nearest place is a community called Shoeva. And they figure, well, let's start walking there. And someone stops as they cross the highway and get to the little access road there. Someone says, oh, where are you going? I'll take you. And they take them up to Shoeva. And then when they get there, people say, well, what do you need? They said, well, we're stuck for Shabbat. And a family who didn't know them at all welcomed them into their home. They stayed there for Shabbat. They ate all their meals there. Total strangers, okay? And nobody was asking him, are you happy with the demonstrations or you're not happy with the demonstrations? This was a Jew who needed a place for Shabbat, and they opened their homes. And this is something that continues to happen, and it's like goes with what you're saying, Janine, even with all the anger that you see on the television, and the anger is really there, okay? But at the end of the day, we're still one people, we're brothers and sisters, and we will always do for one another.
Lovely. Mark, I see your hand up. You're muted though, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, Joy. Sondra, I've got a question for you regarding the situation with the border of Lebanon. I understood some weeks ago that Hezbollah had crossed the border and had some tents there. What's the current situation?
Well, they didn't really cross the border. They're like right up against the fence, which is in a place they're not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a no man's land barrier. Okay, and so that is something that is quite of worrying. And one of the criticisms, by the way, on all sides of the aisle against the government is start taking care of these kinds of things. Don't spend so much time on judicial reform. And one of the things that happened yesterday, which I thought was great, yesterday was the last day of this session of the Knesset. The Knesset now has gone into recess until the fall. But yesterday there was a whole blitz of legislation was passed on all kinds of things that are in complete consensus. You know, issues having to do with dealing with violent husbands or financial issues that everybody was supportive of, and everybody was saying, and I have the same thing. You know, you spend so much time on this judicial reform. If they would just spend much less attention to the, you know, give judicial reform 10% of your attention, but put 90% into your attention into the things that have great consensus. Then even if there would be dispute on this issue, the people would say, oh, but at least the government is helping us with this. So that is one of the things that people are asking a lot of questions. What are you doing about Hezbollah? Now, of course, they're not going to tell us. And we all want that whatever it is the IDF does do, that'll be done with surprise. And so we're certainly withholding judgment, but we begin to ask questions. You know, you got to nip this in the bud. You can't just let these tents sit around there. And that is definitely a question that's being raised today.
Any other questions? I haven't got a full screen for everybody, so you might just have to interject.
Yeah, can I just say so? Is part of the thing with the judicial reform that Netanyahu himself is a bit of you either like him or don't like him character, and he's quite divisive. I mean, in the UK, we have this with Boris Johnson, and actually there's some quite similarities to Boris Johnson in the sense that Boris used to have some really good ideas, but he wasn't very good at project management, and he certainly had character flaws. And I think that's probably a similarity between them. Is Netanyahu, are you part of the issue?
I think you're right. Well, first of all, very often people compare Boris Johnson to Donald Trump. And I think both of them are very different from Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu was much more clever in being able, despite his opinions, which may not have been held by everybody in the country, maybe not consensus opinions, he was much better at creating. I mean, there are always people who didn't like him, but there were a lot of people who didn't agree with him, but admired him. Okay, saw him as a very talented politician, especially in two areas: foreign relations, and you know, his diplomacy successes have been amazing, and also finance. You know, when starting before he was prime minister, when he was minister of finance, he really did do enormous things to improve the economy. And he's considered still to be quite a whiz in economic planning. Unfortunately, though, the way he's been behaving in the last few years has brought us to a situation more like what you're describing, John, of either hate him or you love him. I would say today, a lot of people, I would say a majority, really, really don't like him. Okay. The question is, how many people, even if they don't like him, still think that he is good for the country? Or people, I mean, there's a lot of people out there, politicians, that you don't want to have them for coffee. You don't like them as people, but you can say, but they're running the country very well. So I don't have to have them for coffee. I just need them to run the country. So that's really where things are stayed right now. Even a lot of the people who voted for Netanyahu and may even continue to vote for him don't like him. Okay. But they think, well, he's still the best leader we have. I think that is eroding today. I do. But again, you know, I don't know. I think that time will tell. Stay tuned. We will continue to discuss this, I'm sure, for many months.
I'm sure that next year in the UK, it'll be an interesting election.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And a big thank you for the Zechariah 7 and 8. That's something we'll actually, your comments on that at the end, and we'll both of us will have a look at that later. Anyway, thank you, Sondra.
You're welcome. Thank you, John.
And can I just say, it might seem a contradiction, but some of us had an amazing Tisha B'Av on ascending the Temple Mount with Yehuda Glick, Rabbi Yehuda Glick. And it was just a time of singing and dancing when we're meant to be mourning, but we weren't.
Well, I think
But
that kind of aspect is such a beautiful way of resolving the quandary that Zechariah raises. In other words, if you're saying we're still fasting and praying because we know that we're not there yet. But on the other hand, at the same point to say, but look how far we've come to be able to take, exactly what we're saying, look at the men and women dancing in the streets of Jerusalem, to be able to rejoice on that. And at the same time, if you're going up to the Temple Mount and there is no temple there and there is a mosque and it's problematic, so that you're holding both things in your hand at the same time, which I think is brilliant.
But look, we were totally amazed that Yehuda has such freedom up there now after years of, being arrested even and banned. We were totally free, weren't we, to do whatever with no harassment at all. Yeah, it was really, that's a miracle.
It's amazing how much has changed, and we have to remember that. We have to keep that in mind. And sometimes, and I think this is perhaps the greatest lesson for the people running the judicial reform. Sometimes change happens gradually. And if you try to push it too fast, you end up taking too many steps back. But if you can keep consistently pushing with baby steps, sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's the way to go. And I think that is what you can definitely see has happened in the Temple Mount.
And could I just let it be known for people to watch out for David Freeman and Mike Pompeo's new film being released in September, I think, just called Route 60. Have you seen the trailer yet, Sondra?
No, I haven't. I heard about it, but I really need to look that up.
There's interviews and the trailer is beginning to be shown. And I think it's going to be wonderful PR, for Judea Samaria.
Great. Sounds wonderful. Sounds wonderful.
Yes. Any more questions from anybody? Any comments whatsoever? I see Pam Culpet on the Zoom, and Pam's going to be at City of David in less than 2 weeks' time, aren't you? And meeting with Sondra.
Yes, I'm looking forward to meeting you, Pam. And I know Shmuel is looking forward to seeing you as well.
Yes.
Now, I do have to say that I am just reminding you, I think you know this already, but I am stepping down as director of CFOIC September 1st. We will continue this monthly meeting. Next month's meeting, though, will be led by Shmuel, because I will be taking a holiday completely from CFOIC and from any work for 6 weeks, from September 1st to October 15th. October 15th, I will be coming back to CFOIC, not as director, but as international president, and I will be involved in all kinds of things. And one of the things that I will continue to be involved with will be this Zoom meeting. I don't want to give that up. No way, no how. So I will continue to meet you, not in September, but we will return in October. And
you're going away
in September. You will have a meeting, but it will be with Shmuel.
Are you going on a holiday away, Sondra?
Only for 1 week. Right at the beginning, the first week in September, my husband and I are going to Northern Italy, and we're very excited about that. And then we'll be coming back. But then most of the rest of the time, there's a lot of holidays in there. Jewish holidays begin the middle of September. So for a good part of that time, it's a lot of holiday time. And I'm actually looking forward to being able to celebrate the holidays. And I do a lot of cooking and hosting on the holidays. And instead of having to do that starting 8 o'clock at night and cooking till midnight, I can actually do that kind of preparation during the day because I will be on holiday. So, and then being free to go out and spend more time with my grandchildren and my children and all that. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then when I come back in the middle of October, I will be definitely refreshed, and I will not have any administrative responsibilities, which I'm very happy to shed, but my continued involvement will be primarily being connected with people who have been my friends and supporters all over the world, including all of you.
Lovely.
Okie dokie. Sorry, Janine, you go.
No, I just said lovely. Going to Italy sounds very nice.
Yes. But while you're up in this neck of the woods, you might want to take a jump. It's a little close from Israel. It's far from Australia.
No, Israel is sufficient for us. We don't need to go anywhere else, do we, Janine?
No, it's just
Yes.
Jerusalem is enough.
Right. I get
Yes.
it.
And Hayovel, Habraka. Okie dokie. If nobody
you.
has any more questions, we'll say goodbye. Thank you, Sondra, yet again. Bless
Yes.
you. Bless
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you for joining. I see some chats. I see some thank yous in the chat box. Okay. Judy
Thank
and
you.
Alison. Yep.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.